Welcome to Beyond the Legacy, an extension of the Civil Discourse and American Legacy Project. I'm Donna Phillips. Today we go deeper into our series on citizenship in America. We are joined once again by special guest, Professor Henry L. Chambers, Jr. of University of Richmond School of Law. Welcome back, Professor Chambers.
Good to see you.
Thanks, absolutely. Professor Chambers, let's continue our conversation around the evolution of citizenship in America and its future.
Sure. Let's talk about what citizenship is. In some ways, when we think about citizenship, historically, we think about it as being membership, right? Membership in the American polity. But that triggers a couple of issues because membership can be inclusive in some ways, but it can be exclusive in other ways. And indeed, the history of America in some ways is one of exclusion as much as it is inclusion. So when we think about how the country started, when we think about the Constitution, we say, well, okay, who were American citizens? Well, that question in and of itself was a little problematic. It was problematic because before there was the United States of America, there wasn't really an American citizenship. There may have been a feeling that the British colonists were kind of Americans in outlook, but they were really creatures of their states. They were citizens of their states. So when we think about the Constitution originally creating an America, and yeah, I recognize the Articles of Confederation technically created a confederacy called the United States of America, but the America we're talking about is really the United States created by the Constitution. We had just an amalgamation of state citizens who came together and became American citizens. That at least was the notion of how the American citizen became a thing, or how American citizenship became a thing. What the Constitution didn't do was define what American citizenship was. It didn't define the content of American citizenship, and that has been an issue for the entire length of the Republic.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about some different periods in our history. And so, once the country did come together, how did the notion of state citizenship only transform to, a more modern sense of what we think of as national citizenship?
Yeah, it's a great issue. There are folks who would argue that the issue of citizenship remained unclear until the Civil War. And there are many who would argue that it remained unclear even after the Civil War. But let's think about the antebellum period. So we can ask, how do we determine who the insiders and who the outsiders were? Couple things we need to consider. There were certainly groups who were more privileged than others in antebellum America. So let's think about a couple groups. We can think about enslaved people. We can think about free black people. We can think about women. We can think about immigrants. And all of those folks get woven into the American fabric in very different ways. Right? Who should qualify as being a part of this American experiment? Now, we recognize that women were always considered citizens, but they weren't treated like first-class citizens. So that's one issue that arises is, well, what's the nature of American citizenship if you can be called a citizen, but you don't really get the rights of citizenship? So that's one unclear question that we can sort of think about a little bit. Second group of folks, whether you're talking about enslaved people or free black folks, the question of what qualifies as citizenship was interesting because there were a number of states that allowed free black folks to vote in the antebellum period, going, in fact, all the way back to the founding of the nation. There were some folks who argued that if free black folks who were born in the United States, who were allowed to vote in the United States existed, they should be considered citizens of their state and therefore should have been considered American citizens. That was an issue. That issue was resolved, at least theoretically resolved, when we saw the Dred Scott opinion, where Chief Justice Taney's position was free blacks and enslaved people could not be citizens. Not only were they not citizens, but they could not be citizens. Taney's position was an odd one, or at least it was one that didn't square with the history, but he just made up the history for his own purposes. So you had some issues regarding, well, what do you do about folks who were enslaved and free black folks? We'll put those folks to the side for a second. Now, what about immigrants? Well, the notion of the United States as being a nation of immigrants, a nation that welcomed immigrants, is one that we certainly view ourselves as having, but we have to recognize that there were always limitations on who could be immigrants, who could come in, and who could then become citizens of the United States. Your basic Europeans, sure, acceptable. Folks from other lands, maybe not so much. So that gives us a little sense of what was going on in the antebellum period, the idea of both inclusion and exclusion with respect to citizenship in the United States.
So speaking of inclusion and exclusion, that's a great framework. And it makes me think about, if we move forward a little bit in history, to the Chinese Exclusion Act,
Yeah,
and then the Emma Lazarus piece, the New Colossus,
yeah.
which is on the Statue of Liberty. How do we reconcile two very different messages about who's included and who's not included, and what that means for citizenship in America?
Great. That's a great point. Let's think about a 20-year time period and talk about a couple things that pop up. We think about the end of the Civil War. We get 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment. Right? So we get with the 14th Amendment the notion of birthright citizenship. The idea that we're going to extend the rights of citizenship, or at least we're going to extend the notion of citizenship to freed slaves and certainly free black folks who were born here. So great, we're thinking this is awesome. We're expanding what we think of as citizenship. We do recognize, and with the 15th Amendment, in fact, we arguably extend the right to vote to African American men. At least we limit how states can limit the right to vote, and we say states cannot limit the right to vote on the basis of race. So as a consequence, black men essentially get the right to vote. Now, since we can still limit the right to vote regarding women, that's a different story. That becomes an important piece of the puzzle. So as of 1870, we're in a situation where we've expanded citizenship. We get to 1875 and we see Minor versus Happersett, where we explicitly said, where the Supreme Court explicitly says, well, women don't get the right to vote just because the 14th Amendment expands citizenship. The court said women still can be limited in their ability to vote because nothing has changed with respect to women in the United States and the right to vote. So citizenship and voting are deemed to be separate. Well, all right, that's 1875. Now we get to the two documents that you noted, the Chinese Exclusion Act and Emma Lazarus's New Colossus. The idea of inclusion and exclusion are right there in front of our faces. Right? 14th Amendment inclusion, Minor versus Happersett exclusion. Chinese Exclusion Act, literally exclusion right in front of our face, saying we're not going to allow lots of Chinese workers to come into the United States, and we're going to treat Chinese workers who are already here poorly. We're not going to allow them to become citizens, even though they may look like immigrants who, in theory, Emma Lazarus, whose poem is on the base of the Statue of Liberty, even though that says, give me your poor, your tired, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, we're trying to bring people in the East, and in the West, we're saying, no. Not only don't we want you here, but even if you're already here, we're not going to treat you appropriately. So you think about that 20-year time period and what inclusion and exclusion with respect to citizenship looks like. And we have a real opportunity to talk about our history and to think about our history and to ask ourselves, what were we doing at that time period, and how could we hold these different visions in our mind at the same time? It's difficult, but one of the things that we try to do with American Legacy, and one of the things we try to do with civil discourse, is to look at how we haven't always lived up to our ideals and to ask, how do we make ourselves better, and how do we do better moving forward?
Mm-hmm. And this tension between who's included and who's excluded, how do you see that continuing to play out in our history or in our future?
Yeah, it's a great question. As you note, as time moved forward, we get things like the Indian Citizenship Act. We get U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark, which some people would say, well, that's odd. I mean, didn't we allow uh, Chinese Chinese folks who were born in the United States, didn't we say that they had birthright citizenship? So doesn't that seem to cut against the Chinese Exclusion Act? And the answer is, well, it somewhat does, in that, yes, the 14th Amendment applies to children born in the United States. But that doesn't go terribly far when you think of some of the other ways in which folks may well have been excluded. The fact that we get the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924 means that you had some folks who were excluded from the population and from the populace. So we get the back and forth over time, and with the back and forth over time, we like to think that we're expanding our notion of citizenship, but that's not always the case. There are still some limitations that have existed through time. And of course, getting to the broader question of who will really be treated as insiders, who will really be treated as one of us, becomes a real issue. We had to think about that issue, and we keep thinking about that issue in terms of voting issues. So, for example, DC, Washington, D.C., for years did not have a right to vote in federal elections. Indeed, right now, still D.C. has no congressional representation, no U.S. senators. D.C. residents do get to vote for the President of the United States. Our Puerto Rican brothers and sisters are citizens of the United States, but they don't have any representation and they don't get to vote for president either. That is, those folks who live in Puerto Rico. Obviously, Puerto Ricans who have moved to the United States, to the 50 states, do, but Puerto Ricans who live in Puerto Rico do not. So our notion of what's an insider, what's an outsider, who's a citizen and who has citizenship rights, who can exercise all of their rights of Americanness, remains a question today and moving forward.
Yeah, and that insider versus outsiderness is interesting when you think about the differences between natural citizens, the birthright citizenship, and naturalized. I have two members of my family who are naturalized citizens, and witnessing their journey to become American citizens has been really phenomenal. And they speak of their American citizenship very differently than those of us who were born in America with naturalized birthright citizenship. What do you think about, those two and how those two types of citizenships are treated in America?
That's a great point. When we think about naturalization as opposed to birthright citizenship, on almost every piece, there's no difference between the two, except the Constitution explicitly says presidents must be birthright citizens. And that raises a real question. The real question is, do we believe that naturalized citizenship is still somehow significantly different from birthright citizenship? Now I would say that it isn't and it shouldn't be, because the notion should be that whomever we elect as president should have passed all the kinds of tests that were necessary to figure out whether someone is dedicated to the United States or not. Nonetheless, the Constitution explicitly says that with respect to the U.S. presidency, only birthright citizens are allowed. One question we can ask is, as we move forward, will that change? Might we see a constitutional amendment? Might we look up and say, there are lots of people who are naturalized who not only believe in our country as much as folks who are birthright citizens, but who actually believe more in our ideals than birthright citizens, and as a consequence would be perfectly appropriate to serve in any position we can imagine. Right? Those are some of the questions that we have to ask. There are two other issues that we want to think about. That is, what do we do with folks who are on the path to citizenship, but who aren't necessarily there? Think about folks who serve in our armed forces who are not citizens, but are on the pathway to become citizens. We have no problem with taking the the resources of folks who want to be citizens and saying, oh, we will take your resources. And in fact, we may even have you give your life for the United States, but we're going to act as though you're not quite one of us yet. How we think about that issue for those folks who are on the path to citizenship and those folks who are doing the kind of work that we expect of citizens, how should we treat those folks? That's one piece. The second piece is, how should we treat people who are essentially us, but who aren't actual citizens? Think about folks like dreamers, for example. Folks who weren't born here, but really know no other country than the United States. Folks who are as American as anybody else, but who are not quite treated as Americans. I am not suggesting that I have the solution, but it does seem as though we need to speak and talk about these issues and think about what it means to be American, whether you're an actual citizen or not. Last piece is, we probably ought to consider, what does it mean to be a part of America without being a citizen? So we have a number of jurisdictions that are talking about allowing non-citizens to vote. Folks may be surprised, but historically, non-citizens did vote in American presidential elections. That was cut off in the wake of World War I. But asking whether non-citizens should be allowed to vote in local elections or maybe statewide elections. Federal elections are probably to the side for right now, but those are some questions that we ought to ask. How should we treat people who are part of America, but who may not be citizens? These are all fascinating issues that will be resolved by all generations of Americans, from school children to young adults to non-young adults to senior citizens. It's a conversation that requires real discourse done in a very civil manner.
And on that note, we will wrap up. That was wonderful, Professor Chambers. Thank you so much.
Glad to talk with you.
Absolutely. I think you've given us all a lot of questions that we now want to engage even deeper with one another on. And this has been fantastic.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure having you on the show.